Welcome to Last Memories. Have you ever met someone who refuses to back down after being warned? Well, today we're talking about Karens who died for that reason. From a Karen lecturing lifeguards for 10 minutes before swimming into a jellyfish swarm, to a Karen invading red-flagged surf just for content, only to pay for it in the worst way possible. It was January 17, 2016, on a patrolled beach in North Queensland, Australia, where the water was clear and the signage at the net perimeter had been updated the previous season for exactly the kind of morning this turned out to be. Marlene Kessik was 34 years old and worked as a retail supervisor at a chain store in Brisbane, managing a floor team of about 15 people. She was organized, direct, and not easily persuaded by people she felt hadn't earned the right to tell her otherwise. She had taken 4 days off with 2 friends for a coastal holiday, her first real break in months. People who knew her described her as someone who read situations confidently, sometimes faster than the situation warranted. The stinger nets at that beach were permanent infrastructure, maintained specifically to reduce exposure to box jellyfish, a highly venomous species. Signs at the net entry points listed the danger in 3 languages. Like probably most of you, I immediately understood that the risk was not theoretical. It was documented, seasonal, and specific to the stretch of coast she was standing on. Unfortunately, this Karen thought otherwise. Marlene had read the signs. She told the lifeguard on duty as much, loudly, approximately 10 minutes before she entered the water. She said the warnings were written for tourists who didn't understand Australian conditions, that she'd swum in Queensland waters before, and that the nets were regulatory overreach. The lifeguard, a man in his mid-20s working a routine Saturday shift, told her twice that conditions that week had already produced 2 reported stings at a beach further up the coast. Sarcastically, she told him she understood. Then she walked toward the water anyway. I've thought about what it takes to hear a warning like that and override it. Sometimes competence in one area convinces people they're competent in all of them. I guess you can argue that it's not stupidity, and it's just a pattern, and it's easy to fall into. A teenager on a bodyboard near the float line called out to her as she crossed it. She waved him off angrily without turning around. 2 women on towels about 40 feet from the shoreline were watching by then. Marlene had been outside the net for approximately 4 minutes when her stroke pattern changed. No immediate abnormal change was observed in her movement from shore during that interval. She stopped moving forward. Her arms came up and she began treading water in short, uneven movements. From the shore, it looked like a cramp. Then her movements became sharper and less deliberate, one arm dropping under the surface, her head dipping and rising without rhythm. She made no sound audible from the beach. The 2 women stood up. One of them shouted toward the lifeguard station. A surfer roughly 30 feet away was already paddling toward her within seconds of noticing the change. He reached her in under a minute. She was face up by then, her arms still moving but not functionally. He put his arm across her chest and pulled her toward shore. She was conscious the entire way in. Her eyes were open and she appeared to be attempting to form words, but nothing coherent came out. Her face, he told investigators, was not the face of someone with a cramp. She was on the sand within 3 minutes of the surfer reaching her. The lifeguard arrived at almost the same moment. The lifeguard noticed faint sting marks forming across her exposed skin while assessing her on the sand, immediately shifting the response from suspected cramp to envenomation protocol. Her breathing was rapid and audible from several feet away. Within approximately 2 minutes on the sand, she became unresponsive. The lifeguard began CPR. One of the women who had been standing on the towels placed the call to emergency services. The other stood at the waterline and did not move for a long time. Marlene went into cardiac arrest during ground transport. The coroner's findings described the cause of death as cardiac arrest secondary to box jellyfish envenomation. In plain terms, the venom triggered a response from her own nervous system that stopped her heart before she reached a hospital. Within the month, the beach authority installed larger signage at the net perimeter with additional multilingual warnings and updated photographs of the species. The nets were not moved or expanded. The signs were simply made bigger. Marlene was someone who had learned to trust her own read on things, and that habit had probably served her fine 100 times before this one. The problem is that box jellyfish venom doesn't negotiate, and a beach in January in North Queensland doesn't care how many times you've been right before. Now, our next Karen is almost the same story, but on dry land, where the ground itself lost patience. It was March 4th, 2017, on the Chalk coastline near Dover, England. The water below and the wind off the channel has the particular persistence that keeps walkers well back from the edge without needing to be told, except for one particular Karen. Helen Bramford was 42 and worked as an administrative assistant at a regional government office in Kent, a job she had held for 11 years. She took personal leave to photograph the cliffs, something she had told co-workers about in advance. Though not a trained hiker, she had visited the area before and relied on that familiarity instead of caution. She regularly posted travel photos from her phone on social media. Now, I want you to take in mind that this trip had a clear objective. She wanted something better than what she already had. A group of 4 hikers traveling in the opposite direction stopped when they saw her moving toward the edge. One of them immediately told her, sharply, that this section had been mapped as a coastal erosion risk zone with advisory restrictions months earlier and that people had already been turned back from similar spots that week. A second stepped forward and physically pointed out the visible cracking running parallel to the edge, roughly 2 feet back from where she was standing, his tone rising as he said it wasn't stable and she needed to move away right now. She snapped back that she could see where she was going, that she wasn't blind, and told them to stop talking to her like she was a child. One of the others muttered under his breath that she was going to get herself killed, loud enough for everyone to hear. Now, don't get me wrong, she's not wrong for wanting the photo. But the moment someone points to a crack in the ground and you keep moving anyway, you've stopped making a decision and started making a bet. She did not step past the marker immediately. She spent several minutes adjusting her position, crouching, standing, extending her arm. One of the hikers, a man in his 50s, had already begun watching the interaction, not because he anticipated what would follow, but because the argument had become loud enough that he found it intriguing. His statement became the primary visual account of the next several minutes. The chalk in this section of the coastline erodes unevenly. The surface can appear entirely sound, while the substrate several inches below has already lost cohesion. This is not something visible from above. Needless to say, the cracking Helen had been warned about was not cosmetic. It was structural. She stepped past the marker post, approximately 18 inches beyond it, and shifted her weight forward to angle the phone back toward the coastline. The hikers watching immediately renewed their warnings, with more than one voice calling for her to step back as she repositioned repeatedly near the edge. The hiker filming caught the sound first, a low, dry creak, not loud, closer to what an old floorboard makes under settling weight. Several small fragments of chalk dropped from the face below her position. One of the women in the group shouted again. Helen looked down briefly, then back at the phone. The collapse did not happen as a single continuous cascade. The section beneath her right foot had already been compromised, likely a partially detached slab separated by hidden tension cracks, and it failed first as a single abrupt rotational break. The block gave way cleanly at its weakest fracture line, pulling the ground surface with it. Helen's weight shifted instantly into empty space, and she fell as the slab she had been standing on broke free from the main cliff. Dust rose immediately and obscured the lower portion of the drop. From the rock shelf below, the hikers reported hearing a dull, heavily muted impact that briefly echoed before cutting out into the wind and surf. A Coast Guard unit and cliff rescue team reached the base, and Helen was located on the rock shelf below. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The area was cordoned off for a geological survey. A local authority review cited chalk erosion as a known and documented hazard in that specific section. I don't think Helen was reckless in the way that word usually gets applied to stories like this. She was someone who had already decided what she wanted before she arrived and arranged everything else around it, even if it means demeaning other people, and worse, death. Helen's death was over in seconds. One shift of weight, one crack in the chalk, and it was done. The next one took 4 days, and somehow that made it worse. It was March 9th, 2015, at a mid-range resort complex on the Northern Hotel Corridor outside Cancun, Mexico, where construction dust from an adjacent expansion site drifted into the pool area every afternoon, and nobody working there considered it worth flagging until it was already too late. Denise Breen was 38 years old and had worked for 11 years as an office manager for a property management firm in San Antonio, Texas. She had taken this trip alone, which her sister said was out of character. She had spent roughly 8 months planning it, framing it as a reset after a long winter. A protracted lease dispute with a client had worn her down more than she let on. She arrived on March 6 with one carry-on and a detailed itinerary, carrying the particular energy of someone who had finally given themselves permission to stop. The construction zone adjacent to the resort's east wing was active during her stay. On the morning of March 8th, a site worker on break near the outdoor seating area saw Denise filling a reusable water bottle from a large plastic cooler left outside the construction partition, which was intended for worker hydration and was not part of the resort's potable water system. The water in such construction coolers is often exposed to heat, dust, and backflow contamination from reused containers and non-sanitized hoses, making bacterial growth and chemical residue far more likely than in treated hotel water systems. He spoke to her directly and immediately told her to stop, his tone firm, almost alarmed, saying the water wasn't for guests and wasn't safe to drink. She looked at him like he was inconveniencing her, not warning her, and told him it was probably fine, that it had been sitting in shade, and that she was not going back to her room just because someone said so. When he pressed again, she cut him off and told him she understood how things worked here, then turned away and filled the bottle anyway before walking off without another word. I think she had spent years making judgment calls under pressure and had started applying that same certainty in places where she wasn't actually in control anymore, and maybe that's the uncomfortable part of it. She wasn't just reacting to a stranger at a resort. She was carrying the residue of that protracted lease dispute, the exhaustion of being challenged for months, and redirecting it onto the nearest person who told her no. Her 2 colleagues from the office, also on the trip, confirmed later that she drank from the same bottle during a poolside break that afternoon, and again after an evening walk. Neither said anything. The water looked clear. The cooler had a lid. I'm sure it probably read like something deliberately left there for guests. Hotel security footage from March 9 showed Denise at the pool at approximately 10:45 in the morning. Her movement was visibly slower than footage from her arrival day. She was sweating heavily despite sitting in partial shade and shifted her position on the lounger multiple times over a 30-minute window. She also showed early signs of acute gastrointestinal illness, including abdominal cramping and intermittent nausea, and later reported episodes of vomiting and diarrhea that were not formally documented by staff at the time. A pool attendant approached and asked if she needed water or assistance. She waved him off and remained at the pool for another hour before returning to her room. Now, I want you to think about that pool attendant walking away after she declined. I don't fault him for it, but I think he already knew something was off. On March 11th, shortly after 2 p.m., a guest near the main pool saw Denise exit the east wing stairwell, walking short steps with one hand on the wall. She sat heavily on a sun lounger after about 40 feet. Her skin was gray and wet. A staff member stacking towels reached her in under a minute, by which time she had slid partly to the ground, conscious but unresponsive to his voice, breathing shallow and fast, visibly dehydrated with worsening vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, and confusion over 48 hours. Another guest said her name twice with no response. A third described her eyes open but slowly tracking nothing. The staff member told investigators he did not hesitate. The resort called emergency services immediately. Paramedics initiated IV fluids at the scene and transported her to a regional hospital. The attending physician's summary was that she had severe bacterial gastrointestinal infection consistent with ingestion of contaminated non-potable water. By admission, the infection had progressed to systemic sepsis. Unfortunately, she went into septic shock during the second night of hospitalization and suffered cardiac arrest in the early hours of March 13th. I think there's something quietly corrosive about carrying unresolved stress and negative energy into a place meant for recovery, because it doesn't just stay internal, it changes how you interpret warnings, boundaries, and even basic care when you finally get the chance to rest. Now, if it took days for Denise to ask for proper help, the next Karen didn't get that kind of time. It was November 3rd, 2014, at a crowded underground station in the 9th arrondissement of Paris, France, during evening rush hour, when a gap of 8 inches between a closing door and a departing train became the only measurement that would matter. Sabine Lauron was 29 years old and worked as a sales consultant for a mid-sized textile distribution firm based in Lyon. She had taken the morning train to Paris for a client presentation and was running behind on her return. Now I've seen statements from people who knew her, and she had a documented habit of pushing back at service staff for various reasons. That evening, she carried a large, structured shoulder bag loaded with a laptop, sample catalogs, and a presentation binder. She had used this metro line before. The platform agent on duty had already issued 2 warnings over the intercom asking passengers not to obstruct the doors. The car was at capacity. Overhead station footage shows the platform 4 and 5 people deep near the edge. Sabine arrived as the boarding chime sounded, the 2-tone signal preceding door closure on that line. She was approximately 20 feet from the nearest car entrance. Imagine that, 20 feet. It feels almost nothing to comply with the rule. 20 feet is a decision, not a distance. The man, who later gave a statement to transit officials, said he made a warning gesture, not a grab, as she passed, which she ignored. The door alarm sounded continuously. Sabine turned sharply to the platform agent, her face twisted with indignation, and demanded to know who dared close the door. Did they not see her bag, laptop, and client work? In a shrill voice, she declared she was a lion professional, wouldn't wait for the next train like a tourist, ordered the doors opened, and said she'd file a complaint. Can you imagine being in that scene? The sheer discomfort of witnessing such an exchange would be unbearable for me. She then turned to the man who had tried to warn her and sneered that he should mind his own business and keep his hands to himself. The door alarm continued its relentless beeping, indifferent to her outrage. The platform agent saw her approach and stepped forward with his arm raised. His movement is visible on camera. She did not stop. As she reached the doorway, the train was already in the final stage of door closure, and the sequence simply continued as designed. There was no departure clearance override happening in response to her position. She forced herself into the narrowing gap, pushing her right shoulder and her bag through first, while the doors continued closing around her. The system did not wait for her. It kept cycling the door shut cycle without interruption. The bag strap snagged on the door edge as the panels completed their closing cycle against her. Sabine's shoulder cleared the panel, and her footing on the platform edge gave out. The gap between the train body and the platform measured approximately 12 inches in the curved section. Her left leg went in first. I'm stressing that is the detail witnesses described most consistently in their statements. It was not fast. She went down over roughly 2 seconds, while people closest to her reached simultaneously and made contact with nothing. The emergency brake engaged within roughly 8 to 12 seconds of the first confirmed alarm signal, triggered after the platform agent activated the emergency stop system, which required relay confirmation through the station signaling network. The train stopped with its rear section approximately 6 feet beyond the point of the incident. By the time paramedics arrived, Sabine was no longer conscious. Picture this: her left torso pulled into the gap as the train crept forward, the clearance shrinking to under 5 inches on the curve. She was dead. Service on the affected line was suspended for approximately 2 hours while the platform was assessed and formally documented. Whether it changed anything measurable, I cannot tell you. What I can say is that the agent who activated that emergency brake was back on his shift the following week, standing at the same end of the same platform, watching the same doors close. Our next Karen is from a different continent, and this time, it's an animal that sets it in motion. It was March 27, 2018, on the limestone steps of a temple complex north of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. That morning suggested to anyone present that the stairs were about to become something that a group of strangers would carry with them for a long time. Cheryl Dunn was 46 years old and worked as a senior compliance officer at a financial services firm in Brisbane, Australia. She had taken the trip solo, 12 days across Southeast Asia, and had told colleagues before leaving that she was done with guided itineraries. She had visited 6 countries in 6 years. She wore hiking sandals, carried a crossbody bag containing her passport, phone, and roughly $200 Australian in local currency, and had been at the complex for approximately 40 minutes when the macaque took it. This will probably turn sideways fast, but I can't help but smile at the thought of tourists getting robbed by animals. A long-tailed macaque dropped from a railing to her left, grabbed the strap with both hands, and pulled. The bag came free at the clasp. Several people nearby, a local vendor, 2 other tourists, and a temple volunteer, told her directly in English not to chase. She reacted with immediate irritation, brushing off their warnings as unnecessary meddling. The volunteer pointed to a small, informal retrieval practice used by staff and vendors, involving offering food to lure monkeys away from stolen items rather than any fixed station, approximately 30 feet away on a platform landing, explaining that staff used it regularly to recover stolen items. He had done it before. It worked. She dismissed him with an angry wave, demanding he stop lecturing her and simply retrieve the bag on the spot. After a few seconds, she grew more furious. People were watching her now, some laughing at her. Now, get this. She accused the volunteer and vendor of wasting her time with useless advice and refusing to listen to reason. She moved up the steps at a pace witnesses described as faster than a walk, but not quite a full sprint. The macaque was 30, then 40 steps ahead. The stone surface that morning had a thin film of moisture from overnight humidity and the fog that regularly settles against the cliff face. The vendor watched her go and told the temple volunteer to call for a staff member with food to assist in retrieving the item, and she turned briefly to snap at them to mind their own business. I don't get her actions at that moment. She wanted help, but then told helpers to mind their own business. The steps in that section are steep, each riser roughly 9 inches, the treads shallow, worn smooth in the center by decades of foot traffic. A group of 4 visitors descending had stopped on a landing approximately 20 steps above her. One of them later described to a local journalist that she saw Cheryl's right foot land partially off the edge of a tread and then watched her left foot fail to correct it in time. It started as a stumble, a low pitch forward, and then, because the steps offered no flat surface to catch against and her momentum was already moving upward, it became something else. Her knee contacted a riser. Her upper body followed. She rotated partially to her right side, her shoulder taking the second impact, then her head catching the edge of a step. She continued down 7 steps before stopping against another visitor who was descending and had no time to move. People rushed to her when she didn't move after the fall. Staff at the complex radioed for paramedics simultaneously. Cheryl was unconscious when paramedics reached her and never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead at a nearby medical facility that afternoon. The coroner's findings identified the cause of death as severe blunt force head trauma. In the weeks following, the complex added signage at multiple points along the stairway in 4 languages, warning tourists explicitly against pursuing wildlife and directing them to staff assistance points. In the end, a preventable tragedy born of pride and impatience serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the safest course is simply to listen. But unfortunately, this video isn't about proper listening. Let's go to our last story. It was August 11, 2013, on a public beach in Phuket, Thailand. The warnings had been posted since 6 that morning. Red flags snapped in the breeze, and by midday, several tourists had already been turned back from the waterline. None of that would appear in the content Laura Mitchell had planned. Laura was 31 and worked as a freelance marketer based in Manchester. She had built a modest travel content presence online over 3 years. Coastal photography, destination reviews, sponsored posts, and the Phuket trip was partly funded through a brand arrangement. She had visited 11 countries in 2 years and probably operated from that fact as though it transferred to everything. The flags indicated rip current conditions across the Central Bay, the kind of current that reads as slightly faster moving water until you're past the point where that distinction matters. A lifeguard at the northern post had spoken to her twice before noon. The first time she moved away. The second time she argued, composed and specific, that wading to knee depth for a photograph was categorically different from swimming. The lifeguard documented the exchange in a written log and then more forcefully instructed her to remain behind the flagged boundary, briefly escorting her back toward the dry sand line to prevent immediate re-entry. She was not removed from the beach. I don't know how many times that exact argument has been made on that exact stretch of sand, but I'd guess the number is higher than anyone has formally recorded. 40 minutes later, the northern lifeguard had rotated south to assist elsewhere. She waded into mid-thigh, turned sideways to frame the cliffs behind her, and held the position. A tourist watching from a raised platform near the rental station told investigators the woman in the water did not stumble or fall. She simply moved further out, faster than any intentional motion could account for. For several moments, nothing about her movements clearly suggested distress from where he was standing. Now, before you judge him for not asking for help immediately, he did say that he genuinely did not understand what he was watching. Moments later, she started screaming for help. Now, contrary to our first witness, 3 tourists on shore began shouting almost simultaneously. A woman near the umbrella row sprinted toward the lifeguard station. The northern guard was already moving. According to witnesses, her arms were visible intermittently at an estimated 150 feet offshore. Her movements were consistent with active swimming, but not with forward progress. She disappeared beneath a wave set and resurfaced further out. Then again, each interval was longer than the last. The current was running her parallel to shore, textbook rip channel behavior, and every stroke she took directly toward the beach was working against her. She went under between sets and came up differently each time, lower in the water, her movements less defined. I think about what it looks like from a raised platform when you realize you're watching someone run out of something, and there is nothing you can do from where you're standing. The jet ski reached her approximately 8 minutes after launch. She was unresponsive upon retrieval. Paramedics arrived on shore and declared her dead. The medical report described the cause of death as asphyxia from drowning. The beach reopened the following morning. Multilingual warning signs were installed at 3 additional access points along the bay. Laura Mitchell had a collaboration scheduled, 11 countries behind her, and a camera in her hand on a beach that had been signaling danger since sunrise. That summary is accurate, and it still doesn't fully account for how ordinary the afternoon looked right up until it didn't.